Have you ever thought about how just one single word can completely change how we see an issue? It's pretty wild when you think about it. It doesn't just describe something, it can change the entire game. And today, that's exactly what we're diving into. One very powerful word that's been used to totally reshape a huge debate. Okay, so let's start with the basics. The word we're talking about, invasion. And when you hear that word, what pops into your head? It's probably something straight out of a history book, right? A hostile entry, armed forces, an attack. It's a word that just screams conflict, defense, war. But here's where things get interesting. What happens when you take that really specific military word and you apply it to something totally different, like migration? What shifts in our minds when people looking for a new home are suddenly framed not as migrants, but as invaders? And make no mistake, using a word like invasion here isn't just for dramatic flair. It's a really deliberate choice that swaps out one entire way of thinking for another. And that has some massive consequences. Let's break down exactly how. So have a look at this. It really lays out the two totally different ways of seeing the issue. In one corner, you've got the policy frame. Here, we're talking about things like administration, asylum law, procedures, a civil process. But then when the war frame takes over, administration becomes an attack. Asylum law is replaced by the idea of an enemy, and procedure turns into defense. The entire conversation literally shifts from a legal issue to a battlefield. And this is the really crucial part. When you start talking about war, you start playing by the rules of war. All of a sudden, those careful legal processes, they can seem way too slow, or maybe even weak. The whole conversation drifts into this state of emergency, and that can make people much more willing to accept actions that would normally be completely off the table. Okay, so this war idea doesn't just stop there. It's not a one-and-done thing. It actually kicks off this chain reaction. Once you've planted the seed of war, it creates a kind of logic of self-defense that can be used to justify more and more extreme actions down the line. So let's just walk through the logic here. Step 1, you frame migration as an invasion. What comes next? Well, that pretty quickly leads to declaring a state of emergency. And hey, if you're under attack, what's the only logical response? Self-defense, right? So then what happens to individual rights in a scenario like this? They can start to look like a luxury, something we just can't afford. And look, this isn't just some abstract theory. This logic is actually being considered. To see how, we need to jump in a time machine and go way, way back, all the way to 1798. So why that year? Well, a Reuters report actually detailed discussions of potentially using a law from back then, the Alien Enemies Act, to handle migration today. Now think about that. This is a law that was literally designed for wartime. And the language being talked about, stuff like predatory incursion, it does exactly what we've been saying. It frames migration as a hostile attack. It's a perfect real-world example of that shift from policy to war. All right, so this is where things get even more serious. That war metaphor, it gets supercharged and frankly a lot more dangerous when you mix in another element, dehumanizing language. The source material we're looking at shows this combination is, it's a really risky one. For instance, a Reuters analysis from 2024 points to phrases like poisoning the blood being used in these discussions. I mean, think about that language. It doesn't just describe people, it frames them as a contaminant, something dangerous. And it doesn't stop there. That same analysis also highlights the use of words like vermin. So when you mix this idea of an invasion with language that suggests the people arriving aren't even fully human, you create a really potent justification for some very harsh measures. So this really brings us to the core formula identified in the source. First, you frame a group as an invading army. Then, you describe them using non-human terms. And what's the logical conclusion of that? It makes extreme actions feel not just justified, but like an absolute necessity for survival. Okay, so this all sounds pretty grim. But if words have the power to build this dangerous frame, do they also have the power to take it apart? Well, the analyses we're looking at says yes, absolutely. It all comes down to being really intentional with our language and actively offering different ways to see the issue. So the source material lays out 3 key solutions. First up is something called language discipline. That's basically just consciously identifying the invasion metaphor and explaining the impact it has. Second, strengthen institutions. This means really emphasizing and relying on the legal processes we already have, like asylum law and the courts. And finally, number 3, Offer alternative frames. This is all about actively using different, more accurate language to shift the whole conversation away from war.
And you can really see what a huge difference this makes. Suddenly, an invasion becomes a challenge to be managed. See? Totally different feeling. An enemy becomes people in legal proceedings. This simple change in language pulls the entire debate back into the world of policy and problem solving, and a long way away from the battlefield.
So after all this, why does any of it really matter? Well, because the words we choose aren't just words. They have very real consequences. They shape how we think, how we vote, and the policies we support. And that leaves us with one final, really important question to think about. If our politics are discussed in the language of war, who becomes acceptable collateral damage? It's a heavy question, for sure, but it's a powerful reminder that our words do way more than just describe the world. In many ways, they help create it.